Edward Doolittle is a Mohawk from Six Nations in southern Ontario. He earned his PhD in pure mathematics at the University of Toronto in 1997 and later studied the Mohawk language for a year in the Six Nations immersion program. He has taught mathematics, math education, and Indigenous studies at the University of Toronto, York University, Six Nation Polytechnic, Queen's University, Confederation College, the Saskatchewan of Indian Federated College, and of course the University of Regina. Please help me welcome Ed Doolittle.
So this is the title of my talk, a very brief overview. I just had a few questions. What is Indigenous? When I talk about Indigenous mathematics, you might want to break it down into what is Indigenous and what is mathematics. And I think there are really three different things we're talking about here. And I don't really think that I can answer the first two questions. I can't tell you what is Indigenous, and I can't tell you what is mathematics either. Strangely enough, it's a complicated thing, and lots of disagreement about what exactly mathematics is. So I just want to short circuit all of that and just go straight to what is Indigenous mathematics. And so I'm going to give you 8 aspects of what I see as Indigenous mathematics and 23 examples if I have time. And I just wanted to give you this little thing here. I don't know, I came across it in some work by Veselin Jungik, who's at Simon Fraser University. He does the math, what is it called, Math Catcher videos, and he's drew my attention to this story. I really like it. I'm not sure why, but Raven pushed his mind through and pulled his body after. So I think that's sort of the sort of thing we're talking about. It's about abstract thought. It's about going places with our mind, our imagination, before or instead of taking our bodies there. Now, I often, people seem to be skeptical of whether there can be Indigenous mathematics or whether it has any interest to Indigenous people, because a lot of Indigenous people are not interested in mathematics. And so I just want to show you this kind of silly example. I don't even know if I like this or not, so I'll just throw it out there and see what actually you think about it. Here's a photograph. Maybe it's well known. It's from the Regina Industrial School, so where I'm currently from, Regina, Saskatchewan, an early prototypical residential school. And Indian Affairs actually published this photograph of one of the students, Thomas Moore Kiesick, who unfortunately passed away from tuberculosis. But just kind of like a before and after shot of residential school. I guess it's meant to tell us something. It's meant to act as a kind of a propaganda in some way. One day it occurred to me that mathematics has something to say about this even. So I applied a mathematical transformation to this photograph, and I ended up with that. And so it says something different. And I think this is, something we should be thinking about. Mathematics is really very simple. It tells us about simple things. I guess it goes from simple to complicated, but it's not complex. And I'll explain, I guess, some other time the difference between complicated and complex. But this is just a simple transformation, a reflection. It's available on your computer. And I just thought, well, I'll apply this mathematics to this photograph and see what comes out. So I have a lot to say, and I decided I need to structure it. So I've tried to structure it around some aspects of Indigenous mathematics, which I've chosen 8. So there's creation, there's mathematics itself, culture, applied mathematics, contact, reconciliation, contemporary issues, and education. And so let's just start talking about these things. I promised you 23 ideas, so here they are. In fact, there's more than 23, but I've just kind of jammed a few of them together. And we'll see how far we can get on this today. So first thing I want to talk about this is creation. And to me, this says that mathematics is part of who we are, because we find it in creation. mean, this is sort of automatically what I look for. Is it in creation? If it's in creation, then it belongs to us. And so rocks and waves is one of the items I have here. We find mathematics in the structure of rocks, in particular minerals, highly structured. So there is structure, a mathematical kind of structure, in creation. The drum beat that we often use in ceremony, it comes from nature as well. The periodic motion of waves. So periodic motion is a mathematical concept. So we find these things in creation. And now I don't know if I really have time to play this video, but I'm kind of curious about whether it works. This cute guy is a hermit crab. And he's, they don't make their own shells. What they do is they have to find a shell that's washed up on the beach. And as they grow, they need to throw away the old shell and find a new one. So they are continually hunting for shells. And if you find a shell on the beach, it's a great source of excitement for a hermit crab community. But so this, I don't know, these humble, funny little creatures have mathematics too. They line themselves up in order from biggest to smallest. And they really do this. It's a bit of a scramble here, but when they settle down, you'll find them all lined up. And the purpose is so that they can exchange shells in an orderly manner. But there's mathematics in nature. It's not something that we invented. It's already there. Now, another relationship with creation is the peach stone bowl game. This is something from my culture, Mohawk culture. Gayotawano, we call it. The big seed, I guess, is what that translates into. And this is a game that's played in midwinter ceremonies and other times of the year. The players will divide into two parts, moieties, I guess they're sometimes called by anthropologists, and we'll play for stakes. You take this bowl, and in the bowl are peach stones or some other counter, maybe deer antler, and blackened on one side. And the players will shake the bowl up, and it'll land in a certain configuration of white versus black. You keep your turn if you've got 5 white or 5 black or 6 white or 6 black, and if you get three or 4 white or black, then you lose your turn. And if you keep your turn, you get a little bit of a payoff, and you go again. And there's beans that we use as counters to keep track of how many points everyone has. The game can go on for an awfully long time, and that's actually by design. So I first encountered a mathematical analysis of this game in a book by Marcia Asher called Ethnomathematics. It's an interesting book, and it's an interesting approach, but I'm not really that keen on it anymore. Asher did an analysis of this in terms of what we call in statistics the binomial distribution. Saying that, well, these rare outcomes have payoffs that are about proportional to the rareness of the outcome. And I think that's not a good analysis. It's not really on the mark because, if you go to a casino, sometimes a rare outcome can lead to a terrible payoff, or sometimes it can lead to a good payoff. So there's not necessarily any relationship between the payoff and the outcome, the probability of the outcome. Instead, I'm trying to understand this. So this is part of my current research. I'm working with a statistician at the University of Regina, and my idea about this is it's not so much very simple analysis that Marcia Asher did, but a question of a design of the game. The game is designed to last a certain amount of time, and it's got to be fun too. This is part of the ceremony, but fun is not necessarily excluded from our ceremonies. So it's got to be fun, and it's got to last a long time, but not too long either. So there's this adjustment that has to be made in the game, that it has to last a long time, and that's to evoke the creation story. in our story of creation, there was the two twin brothers, Sapling and Flint, and they vied for control over creation. And they wrestled, but they never came to a clear winner in their wrestling match. And so they tried other games. They tried lacrosse, and they tried a variety of Indigenous games where the rules, it gives an opportunity to talk about the rules within the creation story. And one of the games was the Peach Stone Bowl game, and they played it for an eon without coming to a clear winner. So the game would go back and forth, and that's, I think, what is the message that it's trying to get across in the ceremony is that while the game, can take a long time, and really it's a way almost of teaching or learning about infinity. So there's a design aspect that has to go into the game that we play in order for it to have those properties, and that's really where the interesting mathematics is in that. So I think that's an interesting example. Another one in the creation story is counting. If you look in the Rojinosuni creation story, we have at one point there's one of something, and then a little while later there's two, and a little while later there's three, and a little while later there's four. And this serves a dual purpose, I think. We count in the story in order to help us remember the story properly. So oral tradition, we don't write things down. We instead have memory cues. And the creation story has those cues in it, which are in the form of counting numbers. So enable you to remember the order of things in the story. And I can't remember what comes next. 4 must be next. What's 4? Ah, yes, I know what 4 is. So that's how counting can work. On the other hand, it serves as an educational purpose, that it allows us to teach numbers to children who are learning the creation story. So we find, counting in the creation story. The Cree creation story, which I'm learning about, and I learned a little bit about this summer, the uncertainty principle I've written here, it's a very interesting property of the Cree creation story, is that we don't know whether man or woman was created first. And they say that we don't know which one it was. Someone was created first, but we don't know which one it was. This weird kind of uncertainty there. So I think we should dig into our stories and find mathematics in them. The next thing I want to talk about very briefly is what is mathematics. I said earlier I don't know, but I'll give you a good shot at it. And it comes from Alan Bishop. Alan Bishop has written a lot about culture and mathematics. His work is well known in the education field. And there's 6 things that he says we should look for when we look for mathematics. And those are counting, measuring, locating, playing, designing, and explaining. And so that's what I look for when I learn about an Indigenous game. I say, okay, is there counting in it? Is there measuring of some kind? Is there locating, left, right, up, down, in, out, and all kinds of locating words? Is there playing? Is there designing? So I was talking about the design of the Peach Stone Bowl game earlier. And is there explaining? And this is something that's really important to mathematicians, is this idea of proof. But there's other kinds of explaining that aren't as technical as proof, justification, and so on, that are part of it. So, there's rich sources of mathematics in Indigenous culture. Once we expand our idea of what mathematics is and look for these things, games, ceremony, cosmology, stories, there's just so much of it. Now I want to talk a little bit about culture and mathematics, I think some mathematicians will say that mathematics is kind of universal and culture-free, and I don't believe that, not for a second. Nothing is universal, nothing is culture-free. So there's, even mathematicians are comfortable talking about Russian mathematics, talking about German mathematics, and so on. So I just want to explore this notion of culture and mathematics a little bit. A few things that I want to touch on. Language, I'm going to skip a few of these things because we don't have a huge amount of time. And I've got something like 140 slides, so it's, yeah, I went overboard on this. So I think what I want to talk about is this one here, square versus the diamond. So are these two figures the same? Just give you a second to think about this. Are these two figures the same? Anyone care to give this a shot? I got some yeses. Anyone on the no side? You got you yes or a no? No. You're a no? Okay. That surprised me. All right, why the no?
There's no equality, there's only equivalence relations. So one's over there and one's over there.
Okay.
Two different locations.
Okay. All right. So, what really this you could answer yes or no, and the answer depends on what we mean by the same. And so, mathematician Felix Klein has had a lot to say about this, and says that what we mean by the same means that we can apply a transformation to map one onto the other. So most people will accept moving as an acceptable translation, except maybe for our colleague right there. But the question here is, do we accept rotation as an acceptable transformation for keeping things the same? And some people do and some people don't. So there's this difference, and it's kind of cultural. Why, in kind of Euclidean geometry, we would call these the same, because rotations are acceptable transformations for keeping things the same. And there's a cultural reason for that. The Greeks, it's believed that the Greeks worked on diagrams on the ground. So they would draw diagrams in the sand or on a stone with a burnt stick or something like that. And so people would stand around this thing. And if we had to say, well, it's different depending on where you're standing, that doesn't seem right. So that's why we believe that rotations are in Euclidean geometry, whereas modern mathematics is often done on a blackboard. And people get a sense that there's a distinguished direction on a blackboard, so that there's a difference between this direction and this direction. And so, culturally, I think we're in a different era. So a lot of people will say that these figures are different nowadays. And this does have a connection to Indigenous culture. Inuit people would also do diagrams and drawing on the ground and build maps on the ground and so on. So actually they would build three-dimensional figures on the ground. And if you look at some old-time Inuit art, you'll find it's odd because figures are every which way. Things look like, that would look like I would call upside down, and that's sideways and so on. But that's because they're thinking of it from above rather than from the side. They're losing that now, I think, because a lot of what goes on now is on an upright board. So I think they're losing that. You can probably see this in the art, and sometime I want to do this survey of Inuit art and look at the transformation over time, change over time of their view of rotations. I'm going to skip a few things here. So I want to talk about now applied mathematics. And this is another thing, mathematicians often talk about proof, and they try to talk really about pure mathematics as being the pinnacle of mathematics that we should all aim for. And I don't agree. I've come to change my mind on this a lot over my lifetime. And I believe a lot of Indigenous people are interested in what we call applied mathematics. And I think that we do a terrible job teaching applied mathematics. The pure mathematicians have hijacked our education system. Maybe that's a little extreme, but education aims, all of school mathematics is directed to teaching calculus in university, even though I don't know how many percentage of students, I would say 10% of students, maybe less, really take calculus, and probably even less than that benefit from it, or need to use it in their disciplines. Like maybe 1%. You know, students who are in engineering maybe need calculus, or maybe not. Even, you know, so anyway, I would like to shift this and look at, examples of applied mathematics and use it as a framework for our mathematics education. So I want to give you a few examples of applied mathematics, and these are part of my current research, word puzzles and games, and TP and the star blanket. So here is a figure, and it's not going to come out very well, but this is a figure I generated based on a dictionary supplied to me by Eric Wolvengray of Plains Cree. And this is just one page out of, there are hundreds of pages of similar diagrams. What these nodes are, these are words in Cree. And I don't know, you can't really see them very well, but they're words in Cree. And the edges are, if they differ only in one letter. And Eric Wolvengray has worked very hard on this way of writing Cree, this orthography, so that a difference of one letter means a difference of one sound. So there's a very close correspondence between sound and letter in this way of writing Cree. And so those any two that are connected by an edge are what we call a minimal pair. And that's an important concept when you learn Cree, a minimal pair, because if words differ in exactly one sound, they may be extremely different. They may mean something completely different to a Cree speaker, but something like vowel length is very hard for an English speaker to understand and hear. So, you know, my wife took a Cree course and said, she was describing a picture as part of her evaluation in the course, and said this Buffalo Bill Cody picture, and he's got a big jacket. And she changed one sound and said it slightly wrong, and inadvertently said Buffalo Bill Cody has a large penis. So it's critical for us to get this right. What can we do with this? Well, in English, we have this game. It was invented by Lewis Carroll, who wrote Alice in Wonderland. It's called Word Ladder. He called it doublets. And say I've got a dog and I want to turn it into a cat. Well, I can go through dog. Dot is another English word, but I changed one letter, dot. Cot is another English word. And I've just changed the one letter, and then cat. So I can go from dog to cat in 3 moves. Now we can do the same thing in Cree. With this diagram, I can go from one of these words to another of these words just by following a pathway in this graph. And so this is a kind of applied mathematics, I guess. It's a graph theory. And it's something we don't teach in school, and you're lucky if you ever learn graph theory, even at university. You have to take a lot of mathematics to get a course in graph theory. But I think it turned out to be very useful. In my work, I'm trying to create word puzzles in Cree, and my idea is that we want to do this automatically. We want the software to do this automatically because, for English, it's easy to find English speakers, and it's easy to find people who, not so easy, but it's not hard to find people who can create puzzles. And so there's a considerable overlap between those two groups. English speakers who can create puzzles, but there's so few Indigenous language speakers, and to find someone who can also create puzzles seems like a very rare thing. And also, there's not much of a market for it, right? So you can't make a living doing this. So it's just very hard to find people to do this. I'm trying to program computers to do it. And graph theory is a kind of mathematics that's turned out to be the right thing for doing this. So this is a problem in graph theory. And the computers can often solve these graph theory problems in a flash. And so I can create word ladders now in Plains Cree. And I'm hoping to do this for other Indigenous languages. Here's another example. And this one is a little bit, and of course, you have to speak Cree to really understand this, so I can tell you sort of what it is. But this is a problem about creating a self-referential sentence, a so-called pangrammatic autogram. in Cree, in Plains Cree. So there's a sentence in English that goes something like this. This sentence has 17 A's, 7 B's, and so on and so on. So it counts up the number of letters that are in the sentence. And it's a true sentence that if you actually do that count, everything is correct. Everything it claims is true. Now, to construct such a sentence is an incredibly difficult thing. It took the first person who did it in English, took 18 months and built a custom-built computer to help him with the work. There are some discussion improvements in software and ideas and so on that I've used, and I was able to construct this sentence in Plains Cree that has the same thing. It's sort of like a translation of that English sentence, for some sense of the word translation. It has the same sense, if not the same literal meaning, because the letters are all different. But this sentence says, in this sentence, something like in this sentence, there are this many A's and this many I's and this many O's and so on. So it's a true sentence. It contains every letter of the Cree alphabet, every letter in the Romanized version of the Cree alphabet. And so that's what a pangram is, and it's an autogram, meaning it describes itself correctly. And I worked on this as well with Eric Wolvengray. And so here are various letters. We see that it has all the letters. We had to make up some new words because there's no word for letter in Cree. We can talk about sounds, but we can't talk about letters of the Roman alphabet, because that's a newish concept. So it's interesting, we're learning about Cree. We're learning about meta-language to describe Cree itself. And the same thing with sentence. There is kind of no concept of sentence in Cree. So we had to, again, make something up and find a different way of expressing this. So we're learning about Cree. Now here, Eric has gone through this very carefully and counted up all the letter A's. And there's 36, and that's what we claimed. There would be 36 A's in this sentence. And A with a long A. We use the circumflex accent, but it's better to use a macron here. And there's 45 occurrences of that, and that's exactly what we claimed, and so on and so on. So I'll just skip through all of this. It's just counting. But it's an interesting thing in English. So I thought, why can't we do this in Indigenous languages? And now something that Eric thought I couldn't do, but I ended up doing, is to do this also in syllabics. And so we had to make some adjustments. One more thing about this. We've made a table of frequencies, and we can do this kind of frequency analysis of letters in Cree. And we've used this now to develop Cree Scrabble. So I've got a 3D printer. I've been printing out Scrabble tiles for Plains Cree. I'm going to sell them, so if you want a set of Cree Scrabble tiles, please talk to me. Here's the self-referential pangrammatic autogram in Cree syllabics. And it's I can't even really make sense of this, but it's more or less correct. I asked a Cree speaker, what do you think about this? And she sat down and looked at it for an awfully long time. An awfully long time. And she said, "This isn't the Cree that my granny had to deal with," she said. But, this is about not just the past, but moving into the future. Right? We want to do everything. If we can do something in English, I think it's a good question to ask, can we do this in Cree as well? This is another thing. I don't know if I want to do this. I'm going to skip past what I was going to talk about. I give a presentation, which are actually almost an hour long, about the star blanket. So I was going to just quickly skip through that, but I might have trouble switching from one application to another. So I'm just going to leave that for now. Now, contact. We know a few things about contact, and this. I guess I'm trying to frame this issue about mathematics and how we differ in our understanding of mathematical thinking from indigenous cultures and settler cultures. And one idea that I have is that there's this issue of purification of knowledge. We find this issue of purification in medicine is most obvious. So if you've ever had indigenous medicine, you'll know, say, the medicine person will mix up a few different things. And there's a whole mix of stuff in this medicine. So it may be leaves from a certain plant and root of another plant and so on, mixed together. Make a tea out of it or whatever. And I have been treated by indigenous medicine, and I went to a doctor with a sinus infection. 3 weeks later, I was running a high fever. The treatment was not working, and so I decided to talk to Jen Longboat from my reserve, who's a medicine woman, and she had me cleared up in less than 24 hours. It was superior medicine in that case. But we look at Western medicine, and they're into this purification thing. It's like, okay, instead of the willow bark, what we're going to do is we're going to chop it into a million different pieces and say, okay, the active ingredient is this one thing, this salicylic acid that we find in the willow bark. And so we're going to make that into a pill. And so it's a pure salicylic acid, and that's going to be your painkiller. And that's, we find the idea of purification versus the idea of kind of a mixture, kind of a diversity. So there's, this fundamental difference in the way we approach problems. And I think drawing these differences out will help us to engage in a conversation and to engage in reconciliation, which is one of the aims of my work, I think. So again, there's a few examples that I wanted to talk about, but maybe I'm running a bit low on time, so I'll just skip to this one thing about residential school. And of course, we all know about residential school, something about residential school, but I think that there's mathematics research to be done on residential school as well. And it goes like this: when students went to residential school, and people who organized the school often said that there's really just two things that they learned. They're supposed to learn a whole education, but they didn't. They learned English language arts, what we call English language arts, or just English, and everyone knows what the purpose of that was. About destroying indigenous languages is part of that. But they also learned mathematics. And so those are the two things, English and mathematics. And what is the role of mathematics in residential school? I don't think that has been well investigated. And so this is another part of my research program, is to investigate this. And I have talked to a few people, residential school survivors. I talked to one elder, and she had a lot to say about it. And she said, mathematics is the way they really got us. And so there was a purpose to it. And so we really need to understand this, I think. I would like to work on this. Here's another kind of thing in the reconciliation. This comes from Nassim Nicholas Taleb book, Skin in the Game, and he's a very controversial author, erstwhile academic, and so on. He's a very interesting person, but one thing about him is that he doesn't take any shit from anybody. And he, is very opinionated about things, but those opinions are quite honest, even if they may be wrong or whatever. But I think he is someone who has a lot of interesting things to say. And this is a diagram from his book about the world versus science. So there's the world on the left. You see this giant hairy thing. I would have made it a ball instead of a cube, but whatever. And it's just this is big, and it's hairy, and it's complex and complicated and whatever. It's a big mess. And there's science, this little tiny cube. Science is bounded, and is bounded by its own volition. It says science's applicability is only to this small region. And that's all. We're going to do controlled experiments. We're going to do proof in mathematics, but we have to start with certain hypotheses. And so many things are inaccessible to us that are actually of interest and importance in the real world. And so we see this, science can be effective very effective, but in its own limited domain. And you know, engineering is all about stability, for example. So we look only at stable structures. Right, so this is, I think, starts to help us reconcile our different understandings. You know, the Indigenous people are about engaging with the world and having to live in the world with all of its complexity, the weather, and you know, are you going to find the animals you want for game? And all of these complex questions, whereas science is about, let's control every variable except one and make this small change and see if we can find a difference. You know, I was talking to someone this summer who was heavily involved in fusion research in Europe, and you know, I said, you know, you do experiments on your fusion, like you vary one variable, and he just laughed. He says it costs us like $10 million to run this thing once, and so we can't just change one little thing and do 10 experiments. We have to change a whole bunch of variables. So there, we're running up, you know, kind of the limits of science. Another thing I wanted to talk about is this book. So I won't have time to go into detail about it, but I've written a chapter in this book. So it's a little plug. It's called "Geometries of Liberation" is the subtitle. The title is so long I can't even pronounce it, but edited by Susan Jarofsky. And so I've given a discussion about this sort of difference, about the grid being a way we have kind of traditionally organized things in science and mathematics, and trying to get off the grid, sort of like getting off some kind of addiction. We try to get off the grid and see where that takes us, and it takes us some interesting places. So I'm just going to give that little plug. So we're really running out of time. I got 1 minute left, and I want to talk about a couple of things here. Measuring salmon. So this is a question that's in Alaska Native Indigenous Knowledge is an article by Jerry Lipka and others, and using this as a question in the ratio section of a math curriculum. I don't like this at all. I don't like this one bit. For every 2 king salmon, there are 3 red salmon. So I think about my father when I see this question. My father and I, you know, would sometimes have questions because my father was 100% Indian. Mohawk man from 6 Nations, and my mother was white, 100% white, and so I'm kind of in this weird space in between, and I learned most of what I learned up to my university career from library. So I was very kind of Western focused and library book learned and so on, and I would have discussions with my father about stuff like this, and I'd say, well, 2 king salmon, there are 3 red salmon, right? So it's trying to set up a ratio, and he'd say, well, he would say, well, not always. Sometimes the salmon are bigger, and sometimes they're smaller, and sometimes, you know, so there again is this difference in the way we think. That we, you know, Indigenous people are more concerned about reality than non-Indigenous people. Non-Indigenous people are concerned about some kind of abstract simplification of it, it seems. So, you know, I think this is something that we need to work on in our education systems. So one more thing, I just wanted to say I've written an introduction to another book by Ann Kayander, Kajander. It's going to come out this year, and it's all about math education in Canada, high school math education in Canada. And the introduction, I identified what is Indigenous in this book, even though only a fraction of the authors made a sort of direct attempt to write something about Indigenous mathematics. There's still stuff in there that comes from Indigenous people. So we laid the foundation for this country, and it's evidence when we look hard at almost anything that's done in Canada. We find that, you know, there are aspects of Indigenous thought in math education. So action orientation, stories, land, relationships, holism, the idea of opening our eyes and looking at reality instead of this abstract version of it, and a practical orientation. The last thing I want to say is what I think the goal of education should be, and that's, and to me it's clear, and this again comes from Nassim Nicholas Taleb, that the goal of education should be optionality. We should not be telling people what they need to know, because honestly, we don't know. We don't know what people need to know. The world will be different for our children and our grandchildren. What we need to do is provide them with options so that they can make their own decisions about what they need, what under the circumstances. So that I think has really changed my thinking about education. We talk so much about what we should be doing. We should be teaching long division because we need to teach division of polynomials. And why do we need to do that? Well, we need to do partial fractions in calculus. And I think that's really the wrong way and totally backward way to set about it. We should be giving our students the tools that will allow them to succeed no matter what. And this is how I've come to view the goal of education. So anyway, that is a whole bunch of stuff. And really, I think the best part of all this is dialogue. But I just wanted to show you quickly this poem. I love this poem. I love E. Cummings, who's one of my favorite poets. Not Indigenous as far as I know, but I love the last line of this poem. Listen, there's a hell of a good universe next door. Let's go.